In this first tutorial, we're going to go over the gross anatomy and what ventilation is. Before we do that, we'll quickly go over what ventilation versus what respiration is. Ventilation is basically when you're trying to get air from outside the body into the body and into the lungs. Whereas respiration is when you're trying to get the air from these airways into the actual cells and into your bloodstream so that it can go off to the body. So if we start at the nasal/oral cavity, you can either breathe in through your nose or through your mouth. And then in the nasal cavity, there are these turbinates/concave, and they basically act to whisk up the air. And if there's more turbulence in the air, that means it can get cleaned better because it can touch the epithelium more and more stuff can get filtered out. After that, you go into the pharynx, which is split into three parts: the nasopharynx, which is at the basically posterior part of the nasal cavity, then the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx, which is near the voice box. And then after that, we go down into this trachea, which you can feel at the front of your neck, that cartilage-covered airway. Then you go into your right and left bronchus, into the lungs, then your lobar bronchi, and there are 2 lobes in the left lung and 3 lobes in the right lung, and that's because there's a heart in the this cavity that the left lung needs to share space with, so it gets rid of one of those lobes. Then after that, you get your segmental bronchi, and then your smaller bronchi, then you get into the bronchioles, which have no cartilage and a lot of smooth muscle, and then into your terminal bronchi. Then after that point, we get into the respiratory zone, because this is where respiration can occur, aka gas exchange. So if we go over here, we can look at a zoomed up portion of the respiratory zone. We could start in this respiratory bronchiole, and we know that's a respiratory bronchiole because it has little alveoli popping out, and the alveoli is the only place that respiration can occur. Then we go into these alveolar ducts, which we can see in purple, and they're just made up of basically lots of alveoli, and it's not a structure itself, it's just like a pathway that the air goes through, and it's the purple here. Then we go into the alveoli sacs, which are sacs made up of multiple alveoli, and then we have these alveoli, which are the single little buds shown in red. The conducting zone, so everything above this line, has different roles to the respiratory zone. So if we go over here, we know that the conducting zone has to warm the air, and that's done by the blood supply which surrounds this airway. It also needs to clean the air, because if you imagine breathing in lots of dust particles or like some type of bacteria or virus, you don't want that getting into your alveoli because that can basically go straight into the blood. And it also needs to humidify the air, aka make it nice and moist, because if it was dry air coming in, it could dry out all of these alveoli, which are like 1 cell thick, and if they had all of their water taken out, gas exchange couldn't occur. Okay, so conducting zone is basically making the air nice and ready for this respiratory zone. In this respiratory zone, the main thing is gas exchange, and that allows air to get into, that allows gases to transfer, so CO2 out and O2 in, and that way the O2 can go off to the body and the CO2 can get out of the body. Now that we have this gross anatomy out of the way, we can go on to the basics of ventilation. So the main muscles that control ventilation are the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is a big dome-like muscle within the body, and when it's relaxed, it looks like this. So if you imagined you have your lungs, but you also have all of your abdominal cavity, what we learnt from the rat lab, like your intestines and your liver, and that pushes up your diaphragm. So if it was like a relaxed sheet of muscle, it'll just get pushed up, but once it contracts, it pushes down and it becomes flat. So this arch goes down, and that pushes all of your abdominal cavity, like your organs, out of the way. And because it pushed that out of the way, it created more room in the thoracic cavity, and that allowed for the lungs to expand, so that brings in more air. And because so much space is generated by the diaphragm, it accounts for 75% of basically ventilation, because it brings in the most of the air. So from that math we can figure out the intercostals do 25%. Your intercostal muscles, there are two types basically, the internal and then the external. The way that I remember what they did is that they basically switch around. So you would expect internal to be inspiration, but it's actually expiration. So these internal intercostals pull the rib cage down and it forces air out of your lungs. And then these external intercostals cause inspiration. So they would pull your rib cage up and it would increase the amount of volume within your thoracic cavity, therefore your lungs could expand and more air could come in. Now let's move on to the difference between quiet breathing versus breathing when you're exercising. We know that you get way more air when you're exercising, and that's because this is when you use your intercostal muscles. Whereas quiet breathing, you're just using your diaphragm, so diaphragm only. And because of this, inspiration is active, and that's because when you're inspiring you have to contract that muscle, so you're contracting it, you're using your energy to do that, so it's active. But then expiration is passive, and that's because when you relax a muscle you're not forcing the muscle to relax, it just happens. So that would just passively rise back up due to like all of your organs pushing it back up when the muscle's relaxed. Then exercise, inspiration and expiration is active. And that's because you have both of these muscles working. So that expiration is caused by these internal, which is why expiration is active when you're exercising, but it's not in your quiet breathing. And then you have that external intercostals to help with the inspiration, so cause even more air to get into the lung. Okay, that's the basics of ventilation. So I'll do a quick recap. So the gross anatomy of the lungs, you have air flowing into the nasal cavity, getting rolled up by these turbinates, then through the pharynx, the trachea, then the bronchus, right and left main bronchus, then the bronchi, then the bronchioles. Then you get into the little tiny details like the terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs. The role of this upper part is to warm, clean, and humidify the air, and these little parts down here is important for gas exchange. Then ventilation is driven mostly by the diaphragm, which contracts to pull air into the lung and relaxes to push air out of the lung. Then you have your intercostal muscles, which help ventilation during exercise. And a quick thing I'll note here is this little blue thing surrounding the lungs. So the two black are the two parietal and visceral pleura, and then in between there's that serous fluid. So if we quickly imagine that, so you have your chest wall, if you imagine that here, and on that chest wall you have your parietal pleura, and then stuck to that is this visceral pleura, and between there is that serous fluid which helps to stick it together. So if you were to increase the size of your chest by moving it out, you'd move this parietal pleura and visceral pleura with it, and since your visceral pleura is attached to your lung, it pulls it with it. So every time your chest moves, it pulls up and it pulls the lung out with it. And that's also happening at the bottom of the lung where the diaphragm is. So if your diaphragm's moving up and down, it pulls the lung with it. So if this was like during inspiration, you have the lung here, the visceral pleura, then the parietal pleura, and that's stuck to the diaphragm down here. So when it pulls it down, it pulls the lung with it, which brings air into the lung. And then we'll use that concept in the physiology lecture about ventilation.